Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. Every week on this program, we take a close critical look at the global news media. This time we're doing something different. We're going to talk about a man who coined a phrase we often repeat but seldom stop to explain. You may have never heard of Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian professor of literature turned high priest of media theory, but you're probably familiar with his most widely quoted adage, "The medium is the message." In the 1960s, long before anybody had a Facebook page, posted their whereabouts on Twitter, uploaded images on YouTube, or exposed government secrets on WikiLeaks, Marshall McLuhan made a series of pronouncements about the changing media landscape. What he said then still resonates in the wired world we inhabit today. McLuhan was writing about the effects of the mass media on contemporary life, talking mostly about television. However, his ideas and predictions proved prophetic, and in the tumult of today's digital revolution, a lot of what McLuhan said seems as relevant now as it was 50 years ago. In part 2 of the program, we'll speak with a present-day media theorist about McLuhan. Yevgeny Morozov also has some interesting and at times contrarian views on new and social media and how many of us see its potential impact on society. In short, he thinks we're naive, idealistic, and should be prepared to be disappointed. But first, the media now compared to the message then, from Marshall McLuhan.
At the speed of light, there is no sequence. Everything happens at the same instant. When you don't have a physical body, you're a discarnate being. You have a very different relation to the world around you. And this, I think, has been one of the big effects of the electric age. There's a new kind of humor that exists in America called the one-liner. We used to have jokes, stories, but no more, only one-liners now. Everything happens at once. There's no continuity, there's no connection, there's no follow-through. It's just all now.
I mean, Marshall McLuhan was a Canadian academic who studied Renaissance literature, but strangely created a second career for himself as a sort of media guru, explaining to people what the effect of the mass media, which were relatively new in the 1960s, what effect they had on people's lives.
One of the effects of TV is to shorten the amount of time that people can pay attention to anything.
And he became incredibly sort of trendy. He even appeared in a Woody Allen film.
Now, Marshall McLuhan deals with it in terms of it being a high intensity.
When two characters are sort of having a discussion about what he was on about, because he had this kind of strange way of talking where you couldn't quite put your finger on what he was saying, but it sounded very, very interesting.
Because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So yeah, just let me come over here a second.
Oh,
Tell him.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong.
He was interviewed in places like Playboy magazine and Look magazine, which was one of the American equivalents of Life. He was profiled in places like Time and Newsweek. I think Playboy called him the metaphysician of the media.
When you say the medium is the message, you're really saying that the ground is the message. It's not the content. The actual ground of services. It's not what you say in the telephone, it's the fact that the telephone service is environmental.
There's no journalist, reporter, or media professional, anyone who works within these communication enterprises who hasn't heard, the medium is the message or the global village.
The medium is the message is the most famous and yet controversial statement in the media and communication studies. It refers to the significance of the form over the content.
That a medium is not something neutral. It does something to people. It takes hold of them, it roughs them up, it massages them, it bumps them around. The general roughing up that any society gets from a medium, especially a new medium, is what is intended to be indicated in that title.
So in the age of the social media like Twitter and Facebook, we can see this how the collective experience is really communicated through certain technology rather than what they are really talking about. So the material is more important than content.
The global village is at once
as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged and poking his nose into everybody else's business.
Village people aren't that much in love with each other. And the global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations.
Look at, for instance, the coverage of the Syrian uprising turned civil war. Most of the coverage on the ground is actually coming from people in front of their laptops or literally operating out of mobile phones. These connections would have been unheard of had it not been for the technology itself. So for once, one could feel both connected and perhaps even empathetic with the human experiences of others that are extremely distant and share little to no experiences in common.
Obviously, one of the extraordinary things about the Arab Spring is that it's the first major series of moments in history that were both in part made and also understood through the new media. In other words, forms of communication like Facebook, like Twitter especially, became means whereby people could communicate as part of making the Arab Spring. And they were also forms of media by which people could communicate to explain the Arab Spring.
And so in that sense, the global village that McLuhan talked about was able to create a kind of consciousness of some of those political feelings. There's no doubt that social media was able to create an alternative conversation outside of the official channels of communication, the traditional mass media.
Another strange effect of this electric environment is the total absence of secrecy. No form of secrecy is possible at electric speed. At electric speed, everything becomes X-ray. With the end of secrecy goes the end of monopolies of knowledge. There can no longer be a monopoly of knowledge in learning, education, or in power.
The WikiLeaks example actually quite good to understand the decline of the monopoly of knowledge. And in the age of the electronic media, or in the age of the social media, we can actually access the information by ourselves, and the resources are not really limited and not manipulated by the government or corporate media industries. So WikiLeaks example shows how we can build up our own public opinion in terms of collective intelligence.
The way in which technology has provided access to so much more information has thrown into sharp relief the tension between the idea of transparency that we all think is a great thing and the idea of privacy, which we also all think is a great thing. And if you look, for example, at the WikiLeaks story, there you could see that those two coming into conflict in a very stark sort of way, with diplomats saying we simply can't carry on with our work if it's going to be in danger of being made public, really at any time in the future.
The leaked cables could have a huge impact on hotspots like Iran, North Korea, Pakistan.
And yet the argument for transparency, we should know what our governments are doing, is a strong one as well. So I think that McLuhan's idea of information being much more ubiquitous has certainly come to pass.
So this new form of knowledge production and information construction is challenging the monopoly of knowledge, which is based on the nation state or certain media industries. So it really shows the democratization of knowledge and information.
Yes, we're retribalizing.
McLuhan would find a way of surprising us in talking about today's media.
Involuntarily, we're getting rid of individualism. We're in a process of making it triumph.
He would continue to make gnomic aperçus, come up with weird little aphorisms that are kind of sexy and interesting, and they make you think, and you want to know what they mean, but they're very hard to interpret. And the minute we held him down and said, now come on, Marshall, what does this really mean? He would back off and say, oh, you've misinterpreted me. You've misunderstood me. It's the flip, it's the obverse, it's the other side, it's the other way. So he would be a trickster. He would be a fun person to have on the listening post. But what he actually meant and what he would say,
fortunately is beyond me.
Now for a brief user-generated segment, the branding of which is McLuhan-esque. Our Global Village voices on Marshall McLuhan.
No, McLuhan is not passé in any way. Instead, his work is seminal and still coming into focus. His trenchant analysis of the global village and his new vision of a tribal and decentralized world seem very much on point. He remains, as the jacket copy on my battered and well-thumbed copy of Understanding Media says, the most important thinker since Newton, Darwin, Freud, and Einstein.
The McLuhanism I feel is most relevant in today's modern media landscape is his quote which says, "Our age of anxiety is, in great part, the result of trying to do today's jobs with yesterday's tools." And even though we have tools like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or even Vine, we're still not satisfied.
Marshall McLuhan predicted the global village, but he also gave us warnings to pay attention to what these technologies of the future and of his era were doing to us. McLuhan wants us to think deeply. He wants us to reach inside our brains and create paradoxes and puzzles, to twist everything around until it doesn't make any sense, so that we can reconfigure it and come up with new ideas. And I think that Marshall McLuhan would warn us to pay attention to what the medium is doing to the messenger.
We've just been talking about a man who was writing back in the 1960s and 70s about an information age only just emerging. Today, in the midst of the digital revolution, new technologies have been heralded as the advent of a new and promising era. That has also prompted critics. Writer and thinker Yevgeny Morozov is one of them. He has eloquently warned against celebrating the internet as a panacea for censorship and the control of information, a pipeline that can change our approach to everything from policymaking to governance. He's written 2 books on the subject, The Net Delusion in 2011, and his latest, To Save Everything, Click Here. I sat down with Yevgeny Morozov to talk about Marshall McLuhan, the new digital era in which we live, and what we should not expect it to deliver. Yevgeny Morozov, welcome to the Listening Post.
Good to be here.
We've just done that piece on Marshall McLuhan, and in your book you have a term, McLuhanism, that you attach to people, not in an entirely complimentary way, based on the way they see modern technology, social media, new media. Why the term? Why the pejorative aspect?
Well, I think there was clearly a lot of depth to some of McLuhan's work, and I enjoy a lot of it myself, but his interpretation by his later followers is, to me, somewhat vulgar. And the way in which they start comparing different technologies and different media as if they were playing some kind of a ping pong. Let's compare television to radio. Let's compare radio to newspapers. Let's compare newspapers to the internet. To me, it doesn't sound very useful, in part because the internet means so many different things. It embodies so many different logics. The way in which Facebook works differs from the way in which Instapaper works. The way in which Instapaper works differs from the way Amazon works. So once you start collapsing all of those different logics that these companies operate on under this one umbrella term called the internet, and then we start comparing it with, say, television, I think it creates too many ambiguities, and it actually makes it harder for us to understand the logics on which many of those technologies run.
On McLuhan, did his coinage of that term, the global village, not accurately foresee the age, in certain respects, in which we live today?
Well, I don't think that that was a very useful term because it distracted us from understanding a lot of more evil forces like nationalism that prevented us from getting to a global village. But there was clearly, some kind of a longing for establishing those bridges between Idaho and India. And the idea was that new media like television would allow us to establish those bridges, even though there was very little shared cultural context or perhaps even desire to communicate. So in that sense, I do buy into the Cosmopolitan project in a sense that we probably want people to think a little bit broader and just think more about world outside of their immediate neighborhood. But I don't think that such connections happen just by giving people the tools with which to communicate. And this is why I think so many people are disappointed with the fact that given Facebook, given Twitter, and given mobile phones, Skype, you still don't see people from Idaho having much interest in people in India. That doesn't just happen overnight by giving people the tools. And McLuhan, in this sense, was very tool-centric.
When you use the term the internet, are you mentally putting it in scare quotes? Because in your book, that's what you do. Every time it's those two quotation marks around the internet. What's your problem with the term that you just used?
What I'm trying to do by putting the internet in quotation marks is to make people understand that what they mean by the internet might differ from what I mean by the internet and what you mean by the internet. I do think that it's some kind of religion. It's people invoking the internet in places where they need to go and invoke logic and good arguments. They just bring up an argument that says, well, the internet wouldn't accept that, or this goes against the grain of the internet. Well, where is that grain? I've never seen it, and I'm not sure it exists. So by putting it in scare quotes, I think I'm trying to make people aware of just how fluid this concept is and how sensitive we need to be whenever it's invoked in public debate.
In the Arab world, you talk a little bit about the revolutions, and you talk about this technology being much better at starting uprisings that people describe as revolutions, but you again draw the distinction saying that this technology is a lot better at starting the uprising than it is at completing the revolution. What do you mean by that?
The reason why we tend to think that social media is playing such an important role is, again, because we are focusing only on its power to decentralize, right? On its power to spread communication across many different subgroups and many different pockets of resistance. And once the time comes to actually engage in organized political struggle against already well-organized actors like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, or like the Egyptian army, which were more or less hierarchies that had very well-disciplined communication mechanism.
A lot of people had a lot of learning to do during those Arab Spring revolutions. The activists learned a lot. The mainstream news media had to learn how to use the video, how to verify whether to trust it or not. And governments had to learn how to deal with it. Looking at the government side and what's happening in Syria today, and the fact that this revolution seems to have been thwarted or at least put on pause at a stage that the others managed to progress through fairly rapidly. What does that tell you about what the Syrian government learned as it went to school on those other countries?
Well, I think the Syrian government was from the very beginning much smarter than the Egyptian government.
Smarter or just more ruthless?
Well, I mean, one doesn't exclude the other. So, I mean, they were clearly more ruthless as well, but they were smarter when it came to new media. They were, from the very beginning, setting up their own units, like the Syrian Electronic Army, that could go and hack the emails and hack the websites of the opponents of the regime. They were clearly investing in all sorts of targeted censorship technologies, and then there's all sorts of targeted surveillance technologies that allow them to monitor internet traffic in ways that were far more sophisticated than what we were seeing on the ground in Egypt. So they did have some early information advantage, and I think as the conflict progressed towards outright civil war, of course there is less and less of a role that the internet could play. So from that perspective, there are some limited diminishing returns in terms of how much extra publicity those tools can provide. And at the point where you're fighting against tanks and chemical weapons, there is also very little that you can do, even if you have the best app for organizing on the square, because what you need are also tanks and chemical weapons. It's not necessarily new power to organize that you're lacking.
What do you make of the way mainstream media deals with this new content, initially from North Africa, more recently in Syria, material that is very difficult to authenticate? How would you rate the performance of the mainstream media in dealing with that information, that data?
Well, I think it's getting better. I remember when I first started writing about citizen journalism, it was during the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. And back then, there were lots of pictures that were coming from Abkhazia and Ossetia in that case, and you just didn't know where they came from. And you just know that you cannot rely on people on the ground to go and do the reporting when the electricity is down because they cannot charge their iPhones, right? So you can give iPhones to everyone on the ground in Ossetia, but you cannot expect them to do the job that professional journalists ought to be doing, in part because you want professional journalists on the ground because you trust them to go and do all of the necessary intelligence work and all of the necessary ethical work that requires, a lot of thinking and a lot of resources. So it's not, I don't see new challenges, but the longevity of the conflict and the fact that there are more people present on social media, I think has increased the level of scrutiny that media need to exercise.
You're definitely swimming against the current on a lot of this new media stuff. And I'm wondering whether there are people out there who just think that you're a grump, whether this is a marketing exercise perhaps by you because there are eyeballs to be had on that side of the argument. I'm just, you must have heard some interesting counter arguments from Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Give us a few of them.
I'm sure there are people making that point, but I'll leave it up to them to make that argument. I'm not going to make an argument against myself.
But I mean, someone must have called you like the Antichrist or something like that.
No, I get that all the time. But again, I think people who are in Silicon Valley clearly don't find my message very encouraging because it does lead to a lot of regulation. And I made a very strategic decision to put some extra effort into having my monthly columns syndicated in European newspapers because I know that Europe is the only place where Silicon Valley is regulated. So I get much more traction whenever my column appears in Italy or Germany than whenever it appears in the US, in part because the debate in America is lost. No one is going to regulate Google and Facebook there, so the battlefields have moved elsewhere, and I moved along with the battlefields.
One of the real premises of your book is this whole notion of solutionism and solutionists. Again, a term that I would say you use pejoratively. This notion that we can solve a lot of things through this technology. What's your problem with that?
Well, my problem is that not everything counts as a problem that is worth solving. Very often, Silicon Valley defines problems as problems based solely on the fact that they have nice, clean digital solutions available for fixing them. It doesn't necessarily make those things problematic in any sense. When you listen to Google, when you listen to Facebook, when you listen to Mark Zuckerberg or Eric Schmidt, they very explicitly say that we don't think of ourselves as conventional companies. We do not wake up to make money, which is almost an exact quote from Facebook's IPO letter. And they say that we do want to take on this task of saving some of the world's greatest problems.
So you're saying that they should just call it what it is, that they should just call it, commercial enterprise as opposed to some kind of social.
Well, I think when they position themselves as being in the social humanitarian business, you feel as if you're contributing to changing the world and not doing the opposite, which is how Silicon Valley likes to think of Wall Street. So there are arguments that they're making, but I'm also arguing that policymakers need to be very suspicious of the bridges that Silicon Valley offers them to problem solving. And it's this interaction between policymakers on the one hand and Silicon Valley on the other hand that most of my arguments against solutionism function.
Let me just try one more thing on you, and that has to do with cultural differences. You're someone who comes from Belarusia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. I spent a fair amount of time reporting from there. I picked up a few pessimistic, some even fatalistic traits on the part of people who come from that part of the world. You also told me you spent some time in the Balkans as well. And now then you went to sunny Western United States, Northern California, land of optimism, land of solutionism. The view you take on this technology may well be valid, but I do sense a trace of cultural difference, and I think poor Yevgeny Morozov, slightly pessimistic, quasi-Russian guy, sitting in the world's most optimistic country, it must be tough on you.
No, I'm enjoying my sort of outsider status. There is some kind of a pessimism that does come from the time I spent in the Balkans and the time I spent, in Belarus, whereby I do think that the life improvements that Silicon Valley wants to bring, even if they do end up working, which I don't doubt that they will just remove the kind of friction and the kind of conflict and the kind of inefficiency that actually make our lives worth living, and they make us, strive towards something. And if everything is working, I'm just not sure what there is to strive towards. And I think this is exactly. And I think this is the kind of insight that a lot of people in Silicon Valley, in the pursuit of utopian projects, you just fail to realize.
Yevgeny Morozov, author of To Save Everything, Click Here. Thanks for speaking to us here at the Listening Post.
Thanks for having me.
You've been watching a special edition of our program. Next week, we're back to our usual format, examining the global media, old and new. We'll see you then, here at the Listening Post.